In 1862, as Union soldiers retreated through the dense forests of upstate New York, they stumbled upon the charred remains of what appeared to be an old colonial church. Drawn by curiosity, they entered. Beneath the altar, they discovered a hatch leading to a hidden catacomb, a chilling stone chamber lined with skeletal remains. These weren't ordinary graves. The bones were displayed, arranged with intent, as if revered. Mutilated yet healed, many had endured repeated trauma, broken limbs that had been allowed to heal only to be shattered again. This wasn't a graveyard. It was a shrine of suffering. This unholy sanctuary belonged to the Ravencroft family, 3 brothers, Ezra, Silas, and Caleb. They weren't just religious leaders. They were architects of a doctrine twisted beyond recognition. What they called a church was, in truth, a machine, a systematic engine designed to purify the soul through relentless agony. Their followers, the people of Ravenwood, submitted willingly. The pain wasn't hidden, it was glorified. It became sacred. And in time, even the victims believed it. They begged for the torment. They worshipped it. Because the Ravencrofts understood a terrible truth. If pain is reframed as divine, salvation through suffering becomes irresistible. People won't just endure it. They'll seek it, celebrate it, kill and die for it. And while this story may seem buried in the past, the deeper truth is far more disturbing. This wasn't an isolated event. It was a blueprint, a system, one that has been replicated again and again in churches, in governments, in institutions we still trust. So ask yourself, who gave them this knowledge? Who taught them to turn devotion into submission and pain into a path to heaven? The answer lies in the darkness we've been trained not to see. But if you've come this far, you're already different. You're one of us. And now you're ready to see what hides beyond the veil. Because this story doesn't end with the Ravencrofts. It only begins there. Most people think cults are the work of madmen, wild-eyed zealots ranting in the woods, lost in their own delusions. But the Ravencroft brothers were nothing like that. They were precise, composed. Their charisma wasn't loud, it was quiet, unnerving, the kind that didn't demand your attention, it commanded it. They didn't scream to be heard. They whispered, and men listened. In the summer of 1825, they came to Ravenwood like a storm with no thunder. Ezra, tall and grave, with eyes like black glass. Silas, ever writing, ever studying. And Caleb, the youngest, the prophet, whose voice was barely above a breath, yet somehow always filled the room. They bought 17 acres just beyond the tree line and built a church from cold, dark stone. No windows, just firelight. An octagon, 8 sides, 8 chambers, 8 points. In ancient rites, 8 meant rebirth through suffering. This wasn't architecture. It was ritual in stone. Their first sermon wasn't fire and brimstone. It was colder, more methodical. Ezra stood before the town and declared, "We have been called to purge the rot of false comfort. The age of soft faith is over. What begins here will cleanse the flesh and birth the true spirit." It sounded like prophecy, but it was programming. They didn't command loyalty, they offered purpose. In a time when plagues took children, crops failed, and wars turned men into ghosts, the Ravencrofts gave people something to hold on to. Ritual, sacrifice, control. They wrapped suffering in the cloth of sanctity, and people welcomed it. By 1827, over 100 townsfolk had surrendered everything, their land, their identities, even their children. They wore ash-colored robes. They ate once a day. They called pain the kiss of heaven. And those who doubted weren't punished. They were invited to elevate. The Ravencrofts didn't brainwash anyone. They handed them a mirror and whispered, "Look how filthy you are." And in a world steeped in guilt and grief, people didn't need convincing. They wanted to be clean, no matter the cost. But the true horror didn't begin with the sermons. It began beneath them, under the church, in the dark. Tunnels carved into bedrock, chambers lined with bones, altars built from the remains of believers. Once you entered that place, you didn't come back the same. The catacombs weren't hidden, not at first. The Ravencrofts called them the Womb, a name meant to evoke rebirth, not horror. To their followers, it was a sacred place where the soul could be cleansed, purified, made whole. But what happened beneath the Church of the Pure Spirit wasn't salvation. It was systematic conditioning. The stone chambers were carved by hand, dug day and night by followers using crude tools, their fingers bloodied, their voices hoarse from hymns sung between sobs. They were told their suffering made the ground holy, that every ache, every scar was a sacrament, every bruise a brick in God's temple. At the heart of this subterranean maze was the Chamber of Silence, a void carved from darkness itself. No light, no sound, no food, no water, no human contact. Followers were left alone for days, sometimes weeks, with nothing but their thoughts. This wasn't punishment, it was preparation, the breaking of self, the removal of ego, the death of identity. Only then, they were told, could the spirit enter. But the Ravencrofts weren't just breaking people, they were watching them. Hidden peepholes allowed them to study every twitch, every whisper. Journals discovered years later reveal pages of cold observations. Subject 42 whispers to himself by day 3, smiles at darkness, may be ready for trial. This wasn't faith, it was experimentation. They weren't trying to save souls, they were dissecting them. Then came the 7 trials. Those chosen for ascension faced a week of escalating torment, ice baths that froze skin to the bone, firebranding across the chest, simulated drowning, forced insomnia, each day more brutal than the last. And all the while, they were told it was holy, that pain meant progress, that the more they suffered, the more they were loved. Some cried to escape, but the doors stayed locked. Others begged to be next. That's how deep the programming ran. One woman, Clara Raines, escaped after enduring 5 of the 7 trials. She fled barefoot through the woods, ribs fractured, scalp scorched. When she reached town, she collapsed, screaming one word, over and over. Empty. Not help, not God, just empty. When asked what she meant, she sobbed and whispered, "They take everything out of you, and then something else moves in." Most dismissed her as insane, but those who listened, those who read the hospital reports, saw the truth. The scars weren't random. The nerve damage was precise. This wasn't misguided devotion. It was ritualized possession. Because the Ravencrofts didn't just want your loyalty, they wanted your vacancy. The deeper you look into the Ravencrofts, the more it becomes clear. This was never truly about faith. It was always about control. Every structure they built, every phrase they uttered, every ritual they engineered, all of it was designed with precision, serving one singular purpose: to fracture the self and rebuild it in their image. This wasn't religion, it was psychological architecture. And this is where most people get it wrong. They think cults grow from belief, shared ideals, sacred texts, divine promises. But cults don't thrive on belief, they thrive on doubt. Doubt in yourself, doubt in your memories, doubt in everything except the voice of the one who claims to know better. The Ravencrofts mastered this. They taught their followers to distrust their own minds. Trauma was no longer a wound. It was rebranded as spiritual proof. Victims of abuse were told they'd been chosen for refinement. Addicts were vessels being emptied. The more broken you were, the more sacred your suffering. Pain became prophecy. Weakness became worth. It was psychological engineering at its most terrifying. They rewrote pain into purpose. They rewrote fear into obedience. And eventually, they rewrote love into sacrifice. One mother, Anne Coulter, willingly offered up her 5-year-old son, Eli, for a so-called child trial, a symbolic rite of purity, she was told. But Eli never came back. When Anne wept, Elder Ezra embraced her and whispered, "The Lamb opens the gate. Your womb was his first altar. You've done God's work." And she believed him. She didn't just forgive them, she thanked them. That's how deep the programming went. The Ravencrofts didn't demand loyalty. They created it by erasing everything else first. They used methods of indoctrination so refined, modern intelligence agencies wouldn't formally document them until nearly a century later. Isolation, repetition, forced starvation, rigid hierarchy, public shame, reward through suffering. They turned spiritual salvation into a controlled substance, and they were the sole distributor. But the most chilling part, this wasn't an isolated phenomenon. Survivor testimonies, buried government memos, scattered church records, they all point toward one harrowing truth. The Ravencrofts weren't working alone. They had resources, backers, communications with unnamed parties, some possibly from outside the country. Protected, watched, funded. This wasn't just a fringe cult in the woods. It was a trial run, a prototype, for something global, something institutional. And if that's true, then the Church of the Pure Spirit wasn't the conclusion. It was just the beginning. By 1836, the Ravencrofts had accomplished what kings and governments had only fantasized about: complete psychological control. They didn't rule by force, they ruled by devotion. Their church was no longer just a place of worship. It was a living organism, a surveillance machine in robes and ash. Followers policed one another, not out of fear, but out of faith. They reported not betrayal, but hesitation, a pause too long in the wrong chamber, a stumble in recitation, a blink during a sermon. Every gesture was scrutinized, every breath judged. It wasn't just about obedience, it was about perfect, involuntary submission. And those found wavering weren't met with punishment in any traditional sense. There were no public beatings, no locked cells. Instead, they were invited, privately, reverently, to a session with Prophet Caleb. No one returned from those sessions the same. Some came back hollowed, eyes wide but empty, their voices slow, their movement stiff. It was as if something inside had been scooped out and replaced with silence. Others never came back at all. Caleb claimed he could see guilt with a glance, that he could burn spiritual disease from the soul just by looking into your eyes. And the congregation believed him. They saw him not as a man, but as a purifier. But Caleb was hiding something. He wasn't just working with prayers and sermons. He was experimenting with voice entrainment, low-frequency tones, repetitive invocations, breath manipulation, techniques that would later surface in classified behavioral control programs like MKUltra, Project Artichoke, and Monarch. But Caleb was doing it a century before any of that existed. And what he discovered terrified even his brothers. Fragments of Elder Ezra's journals, rescued decades later from the ruins of a burned farmhouse, revealed chilling insight. Caleb had developed a vocal technique so potent, so unnatural, that he could reportedly stop a man's heart with a whisper. Ezra called it the shepherd's tongue. In one entry, he wrote, "He speaks now with the breath of God. I tremble before him. I who taught him now kneel at his feet." That was the turning point. Caleb no longer led rituals, he designed them. Ezra, once the unquestioned voice of the church, became his servant, his mouthpiece, his executor. The shift was subtle, almost invisible, but to those who watched closely, it was undeniable. The prophet had become something more. Not a leader, not a man, a vessel. And whatever was speaking through him now was no longer human. He understood something ancient, something hidden in plain sight, that the human mind, when exposed to repetitive stimulus, sound, rhythm, ritual, begs to surrender. Not because it is weak, but because it craves order, even in chaos. So Caleb rewrote the rituals. No longer were the 7 trials a test, they became a template, each phase choreographed down to the second. The incense, the hum of the lanterns, the pulsing chant, low and slow like a heartbeat beneath the floor. Even the sequence of pain became mathematical. And, like clockwork, the initiates would descend, first in trembling, then in tears, then in trance. This was no longer purification. This was programming. By 1838, the Church of the Pure Spirit was not just producing fanatics, it was producing echoes. Men and women who spoke in identical cadence, who moved with the same eerie synchronicity, who no longer referred to themselves as I, but only as vessels. Witnesses described rows of them, kneeling in unison, eyes closed, rocking slowly to the prophet's whispers. Not one flinched when screams echoed from the chamber below. The Ravencrofts had created something darker than a cult. They had created a closed cognitive system, a human algorithm where every thought led back to the source, Caleb. And in that echo chamber, reality itself began to shift. Followers reported visions, voices from the walls, time moving differently inside the sanctuary, days that felt like hours, hours that stretched into eternity. They weren't hallucinating, they were disassociating. It's a known psychological response. Under conditions of intense trauma and sensory control, the brain detaches, creates compartments. And that's when the real transformation begins. Not just of belief, but of identity. You stop being who you were. You become what they need you to be. By 1839, conversions weren't being preached anymore. They were being installed. Caleb didn't just control what his followers did. He controlled what they could imagine. By the spring of 1840, the Ravencroft brothers no longer needed to recruit. People came on their own. Drawn by whispers, murmurs in taverns, trading posts, travelers' journals, rumors of a church hidden in the woods where broken souls were healed in fire. They came in grief, in shame, in guilt, and they found exactly what they were looking for: judgment masquerading as redemption. But what most didn't realize was that entry into the Church of the Pure Spirit was not a beginning. Ezra had become selective, no longer accepting just any follower. Now, initiates were examined like livestock. She carries guilt in the spine, Deacon Silas once wrote in a confiscated note. It pools there, makes her compliant. They had a taxonomy of pain, types of trauma they could mold like clay. Caleb could read it in the eyes, the way someone flinched when spoken to, the hesitation before speaking. He said these were invitations, signs the spirit had left the door open. And when the door was open, he stepped inside. No violence, not yet. Just love, understanding, a depth of attention the broken rarely receive. He'd take their hand, whisper their deepest shame, like he had pulled it from their blood, and then offer them something no other priest, prophet, or doctor could. Suffering is not your curse, he'd say. It is your assignment. God trusted you with pain. And for the first time in years, maybe decades, they believed it. This is the trap most never saw coming. Because we want pain to mean something. We need it to. The chaos of life is too unbearable otherwise. And so the Ravencrofts didn't need to convince. They needed only to reframe. And when the frame was set, when reality was boxed in just right, the mind would fold inward. Faith, logic, love, fear, everything would contort to fit. And once it fits, it never forgets. This wasn't brainwashing. This was soul binding. By midsummer, new converts were no longer merely joining. They were volunteering to suffer, begging for it. One woman reportedly crawled for 6 miles to reach the church gates, her knees bleeding through the stones. She said the spirit told her, "Only blood speaks clearly." And inside the Ravencroft compound, that message had already become law. By autumn of 1840, the rituals no longer occurred in shadows. They were celebrated. The Ravencrofts had inverted the sacred. What was once hidden in shame was now elevated in pride. Congregants didn't just tolerate the suffering, they sang hymns while it happened. They rejoiced as their brothers and sisters screamed. Because pain was no longer pain, it had become currency. The more one suffered, the more spiritual authority they gained. The more scars, the closer to God. And just like that, a hierarchy emerged. Those who had undergone the full 7 trials were marked, literally. Burned symbols on the base of the spine, between the ribs, sometimes the soles of the feet. Each mark signified a completed refinement. One member was quoted saying, "You could feel their holiness like a furnace behind their eyes." It became status, power, proof. A man who once couldn't find work in Ravenwood was now bowing before the congregation, arms outstretched, while others wept at his feet. Why? Because he had ascended and returned. Returned broken, but radiant. Do you understand how dangerous that is? When the only way to rise is to fall further than anyone else. When the only way to gain respect is to suffer louder than the man beside you. This was not a cult. This was a pyramid of pain. And at the apex stood Prophet Caleb. He barely spoke anymore. He didn't need to. He would enter the sanctuary barefoot, eyes closed, mouth whispering some angelic gibberish no one dared question. They said his feet never left a print, that snow melted before he touched it. But here's the deeper truth. He wasn't the puppet master. He was the proof. The Ravencrofts had built a system so twisted, so complete, that even the leaders began to believe their own lie. They were no longer pretending to be vessels of the divine. They believed they were the divine. And the congregation followed, blindly, completely, because there is nothing more terrifyingly powerful than a man who believes his darkness is holy. You think it stops there? You think they were content with a few dozen lost souls and a crypt full of bones? No, that was never the end. That was just the first circle. The next phase required multiplication. But to grow, they would need something more than rituals. They would need children. By the fall of 1837, Ravenwood was no longer recognizable. What had once been a small, struggling farming town had become a fortress of silence. Outsiders rarely passed through anymore, and those who did reported the same strange details. Children who didn't blink, women who spoke in perfect unison, men with smiles too wide, standing motionless in the fields for hours. Mail stopped coming. Storefronts were shuttered. No births were recorded for 2 years, yet the town's population somehow grew. Inside the Church of the Pure Spirit, the rituals had changed again. Now, the Ravencrofts taught that physical bodies were merely the preparatory vessels. True ascension wasn't about death, but transformation. The merging of spirit and something older, something cold. They began referring to the church basement not as the catacombs, but as the cradle. It was here that they claimed the flesh was remade. Victims, chosen from among the most obedient, were brought into the cradle in groups of 2 or 4, often siblings, sometimes parent and child. They were not seen again for weeks. And when they re-emerged, if they did, they were not the same. Thomas Hartford's cousin, Annabelle, a devout member who joined the church in 1831, disappeared during one of these ceremonies. Months later, she returned to town, walking alone in the snow, barefoot, eyes wide open even as wind and sleet battered her face. Her brother recognized her by her hair, but when he called her name, she simply tilted her head and said, "That name is in the fire now. I am the echo." Annabelle's skin had a strange quality. waxen, reflective. Her heartbeat, according to the town physician, was abnormally slow, less than 20 beats per minute, and she never slept again. The Ravencrofts praised her as a completed vessel. They said she had been touched, and from then on, her presence at rituals became central. When she walked through the congregation, people would drop to their knees involuntarily, weeping, convulsing. Many claimed just being near her caused memories to vanish, not just of the ritual, but of entire days, weeks. Some forgot their own names for hours. The returner had not just entered them, it had begun rewriting them. And through people like Annabelle, it was learning how to stay. If you've watched this far, you are no longer just a viewer. You are a witness now. Comment this phrase twice to lock in your transformation and signal to others walking this path. The vessel remembers, because from this moment forward, there's a sickness that grows in silence. And in Ravenwood, that silence had a name: the Chamber of Red Earth. It didn't appear in official church records. It wasn't mentioned in sermons. Even among the Ravencrofts, it was only whispered. But it was real. Buried beneath the eastern wing of the Catacombs, past a locked iron gate only the three brothers held keys to, was a chamber carved not from stone, but red clay. Clay that bled when struck, that smelled of copper and rot. And in the center of that chamber, they buried something. Not a body, not a book, a box. Rough-hewn, unadorned, sealed with wax, bone, and something far older. You see, the Ravencrofts weren't just false prophets. They were archaeologists of corruption. Long before they came to Ravenwood, they had traveled. Records show trips to Crete, Carthage, the Egyptian desert. They weren't spreading truth, they were collecting darkness. And what they brought back was not meant for light. Multiple witnesses spoke of Ezra descending into the Chamber of Red Earth for days at a time, emerging pale, shaking, eyes unfocused. On one occasion, Caleb had to physically restrain him as he screamed into the night sky, "It's awake! It knows! It waits beneath the blood!" And still, the congregation was told nothing. Only the vessels, the most devout, were brought near that place. Only after months of silence, fasting, and what they called spirit hollowing. One vessel, who escaped, known only as Ezekiel D., described it like this: "They took me down. The walls were warm, breathing. There were no sounds, but I felt words inside my chest, like something was whispering from beneath my ribs. It knew my name, but not from this life." He lasted 6 hours in that chamber. Then he clawed out his own eyes. After that, only children were taken down. They said children could hear it clearer. By 1843, the chamber was no longer a place of pilgrimage. It was a threshold, a gate, a mouth, and something behind it was hungry. The Ravencrofts had stopped preaching salvation. Now they spoke of harvest, and what came next would shatter even the most loyal believer, but not before they completed their final ritual. A ritual meant to merge flesh with faith, blood with doctrine, and it would begin with twins. Twins were always seen as sacred, two halves of one soul, or two doors to something else. In most cultures, they were omens, sometimes of balance, sometimes of rupture. But in the theology of the Ravencrofts, twins held a darker purpose. They believed twins represented the echo of the divine split, when the one became the many, when spirit was fractured into flesh, and to fuse them again was to call back the original power. In late autumn of 1844, a pair of orphaned twin boys arrived in Ravenwood, 8 years old, gaunt, unwanted, brought in by a merchant from Albany who claimed their mother had died of madness and begged the church to take them. The Ravencrofts welcomed the boys with open arms. They gave them new names, Malachi and Gideon. The congregation was told the children were blessed by the Spirit, that they would be raised as living arks, pure vessels, untouched by the world. But in truth, their fate had been sealed the moment they entered the church. From that day forward, they were kept apart, different rooms, different schedules, forbidden to speak. Why? Because Prophet Caleb believed their connection, their twinship, had to be strained to maximize the energy when it was finally reunited. For over a year, the boys were reshaped, not agitated, not loved, but conditioned, subjected to psychological fragmentation. Malachi was praised, adored, given treats. Gideon was beaten, silenced, made to confess sins he never committed. Then, on the eve of the winter solstice, exactly 15 years after the First Ascension, the Ravencrofts made an announcement. The unification shall now begin. The church filled with over 200 followers, their largest gathering to date. The twins were brought forth, both dressed in pure white, their skin pale from months underground, their eyes wide but empty. And for the first time in a decade, the Ravencrofts sealed the church from within. No one would leave, not until it was done. What followed was described by one former member, now confined to an asylum in Connecticut, as a ceremony so foul it made death look like mercy. The twins were not meant to survive it. One was to consume the other, in spirit and body. The Ravencrofts believed this would open the veil. And they were right. Because after that night, nothing in Ravenwood was ever the same again, and the town itself would begin to change. The morning after the unification ritual, Ravenwood changed, not just spiritually, but visibly. Locals began to speak of a heavy stillness in the air, a thick silence that no birdsong could pierce. The snow that winter clung to the trees longer than it should have. The river slowed. And in the deepest woods, animals were found with eyes clouded white and limbs twisted backward. But within the Church of the Pure Spirit, these were hailed as signs of favor, evidence that the ritual had torn the veil, as Elder Ezra described it, and that the spirit realm had begun to bleed into the flesh world. No one ever saw the twins again. Some say Malachi died and Gideon lived. Others believe both boys were sacrificed. And something else, something wearing their faces, walked out of that ritual chamber. One witness, an elderly member named Ruth Ellen, would later confess under morphine sedation. What they brought through, it wasn't the spirit, it wasn't God, and it wasn't human. She claimed the Ravencrofts had built the chamber beneath the church to act as a gate, a symbolic womb of stone and suffering, meant to birth a new form of consciousness. And through that gate, something had stepped, not into our world entirely, but close enough to whisper and feed. From that day forward, a new doctrine was preached. No longer was salvation about individual purification. That was primitive. Now it was about becoming vessels, not of spirit, but of the thing behind the spirit. They called it the Returner, a force older than Scripture, older than flesh. It wasn't evil in the sense people understood. It simply saw humans the way humans see clay, something to mold, to shape, to hollow out. Every Sunday, the Ravencrofts led the congregation in chants, not prayers, but invocations, words with no meaning in any known language. Members were taught to empty their minds during these sessions, to allow their thoughts to be replaced, to become clear for the voice. Soon many began hearing that voice in their dreams. It didn't speak in words, it showed images, spirals, mouths opening in impossible places, hands growing where hands shouldn't be, and always, always the twins, standing silently, smiling, whispering something no one could remember after waking, but everyone could feel. And from that point on, the conversions became irreversible. By the fall of 1837, Ravenwood was no longer recognizable. What had once been a small, struggling farming town had become a fortress of silence. Outsiders rarely passed through anymore, and those who did reported the same strange details. Children who didn't blink, women who spoke in perfect unison, men with smiles too wide, standing motionless in the fields for hours. Mail stopped coming. Storefronts were shuttered. No births were recorded for 2 years, yet the town's population somehow grew. Inside the Church of the Pure Spirit, the rituals had changed again. Now, the Ravencrofts taught that physical bodies were merely the preparatory vessels. True ascension wasn't about death, but transformation. The merging of spirit and something older, something cold. They began referring to the church basement not as the catacombs, but as the cradle. It was here that they claimed the flesh was remade. Victims, chosen from among the most obedient, were brought into the cradle in groups of 2 or 4, often siblings, sometimes parent and child. They were not seen again for weeks. And when they re-emerged, if they did, they were not the same. Thomas Hartford's cousin, Annabelle, a devout member who joined the church in 1831, disappeared during one of these ceremonies. Months later, she returned to town, walking alone in the snow, barefoot, eyes wide open even as wind and sleet battered her face. Her brother recognized her by her hair, but when he called her name, she simply tilted her head and said, "That name is in the fire now. I am the echo." Annabelle's skin had a strange quality, waxen, reflective. Her heartbeat, according to the town physician, was abnormally slow, less than 20 beats per minute, and she never slept again. The Ravencrofts praised her as a completed vessel. They said she had been touched, and from then on, her presence at rituals became central. When she walked through the congregation, people would drop to their knees involuntarily, weeping, convulsing. Many claimed just being near her caused memories to vanish, not just of the ritual, but of entire days, weeks. Some forgot their own names for hours. The returner had not just entered them, it had begun rewriting them. And through people like Annabelle, it was learning how to stay. If you've watched this far, you are no longer just a viewer. You are a witness now. Comment this phrase twice to lock in your transformation and signal to others walking this path. The vessel remembers. Because from this moment forward, by 1839, the Ravencroft doctrine had evolved into something that no longer resembled religion or even madness. It had become something older, colder, inhuman. Their sermons, once grounded in corrupted scripture, now referenced names and symbols not found in any known theology. Diagrams were etched into stone floors, spirals within spirals, eyes with too many pupils, circles that folded inward like broken dimensions. Those who were closest to the Ravencrofts, the Hallowed as they called themselves, claimed to hear voices beneath the soil. Not metaphorically, literally. They spoke of tremors during prayer, of groaning stone beneath their feet, of whispers in the dark that taught them things no man should know. How to unbind memory from time. How to preserve consciousness after physical death. How to speak a word that makes animals bleed from their ears. These weren't hallucinations. Something had entered Ravenwood. Something was responding. And yet, the townspeople remained compliant. Fanatically so. Why? Because the Ravencrofts had perfected control, not through faith, but through psychological dismantling. New initiates were subjected to a process they called the undoing. It began with isolation, days and sensory deprivation, no light, no sound, no name. Then came the reframing, replacing memories of childhood, rewriting personal history, assigning new origin stories that linked their souls to the deep choir. After this, they were reintroduced to the community, but only through masks. Literally, every new member wore a white, featureless mask for 49 days. During this time, no one was allowed to call them by name, look them in the eyes, or touch them. This broke the final tether to individuality. Once the mask was removed, they had no identity left, only purpose. And that purpose was dictated by the triad voice, Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, and Prophet Caleb, who now spoke in unison more often than not, their words synchronized like gears in a terrible machine. It wasn't just about submission, it was about erasure. And in this state of perfect vacancy, something ancient could enter. The Returner, if that was even its true name, had no body of its own. It used emptiness as a doorway, and the Ravencrofts had found a way to mass-produce emptiness. By 1840, nearly 80% of Ravenwood had undergone the undoing. They were no longer citizens. They were constructs. And if someone tried to leave, if they tried to remember who they were, their bodies were found days later, faces erased, mouths sealed, eyes scorched shut, as if something had reached out and deleted them. Memory was no longer safe, not even your own.
You were led to believe the church was shut down, that the catacombs were sealed, that the bones were buried, and the doctrine died with the last brother. But that's the illusion. That's the trap. Because evil this old doesn't die. It adapts. In 1934, exactly 100 years after the last known ritual in Ravenwood, a classified project was quietly approved by a special division within the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence. The file was labeled Project Hollow Light. The objective? Psychological field manipulation through sensory deprivation and induced ritual suffering. Sound familiar? The surviving Ravencroft texts were not destroyed. They were studied, passed between black-budget programs like MK Ultra, Artichoke, and something even darker, Project Chariot, which reportedly used religious trauma to fracture and reprogram identity. They didn't burn the cult, they weaponized it. Today, fragments of the Ravencroft doctrine live on, in silent retreats that border on sensory collapse, in corporate wellness seminars that demand submission and suffering, in elite initiation rites masked as performance art, and in institutions of power where pain is still seen as the highest form of transformation. Have you ever felt it? That sick feeling when you're forced to smile through misery, when your suffering is praised as growth, when systems demand your compliance, not through force, but through ritualized self-sacrifice. That's not random. That's not modern stress. That's the echo of a forgotten altar. Every era has its Ravencroft. They just change the uniforms, swap the steeple for a boardroom, replace the inverted cross with the logo. But the doctrine is the same. Break the body, hollow the soul, fill the vessel, control the mind. The twisted genius of the Ravencroft cult wasn't in their brutality. It was in their system. A closed circuit of pain, obedience, and identity erasure that replicated itself like a virus. And if you felt empty lately, like something sacred was taken from you, maybe it wasn't just life. Maybe it was the same ancient machine working through new hands. If you've made it this far, you're not who you were when we started. You've seen behind the curtain. You've tasted the hidden script. Now, lock it in. Comment the phrase, "The vessel awakens. The shepherds are watching." Write it twice. Once for the algorithm, once for yourself. Because once you've seen the design, you can never unsee it. This isn't just a story. It's a warning. And now, you carry it. Welcome to the other side.